Hello, everyone, and welcome to this AM Digital webinar on primary source literacy in Europe, empowering students and researchers with the practical tools they need. My name is Dr. Laura Blumbar, and I work in the engagement team at AM Digital. And before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping notes. So today's webinar is being recorded, so there'll be a recording available at the end. Everyone is muted. If you're having any difficulty with the computer audio, please let us know in the chat and we'll try and help. And there is also alternate audio that is available in your webinar invite. And we'll do our best to help with any technical issues in behind the scenes. There's a Q&A function in your control panel, so please feel free to submit any questions to any of our panelists using that, and we'll do a Q&A at the end where we'll look at your questions. So I'm really excited to have three really great guest speakers speaking to us today on the importance of different types of primary sources. First, we'll have Ainhoa Campos Posada from Universidad Complutense de Madrid with a talk titled The Fight for Civil Rights, an Approach Through Legal Records. After Ainhoa, we'll have Professor Giampiero Brunelli from Sapienza Università di Roma with a presentation titled Exploring Globalisation and 18th Century Periodicals. And then finally, as our last speaker, we'll have Professor Jerzy Zdanowski from Andrzej, Frycz, Modrzewski, Krakow University with a speech on using government documents, diplomatic service correspondence of 20th century history. Each of our three speakers today will talk about 10 minutes. But first, before we get to their sections, I'm just going to talk for about 10 minutes to give you a quick overview of AM Digital and how we work with archives and museums to digitize their material. And then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So on this slide, you can get a little sense of the journey that each AM Digital collection goes through from the moments when we first partner with an archive or a number of different archives around the world, up to the moments when the collection is something that you and your students can access on your laptops. And the difference that this digital access makes can be really crucial. So before, the main way researchers would access the information they needed would be to secure research grants and physically to travel to that archive, which might often be a very kind of large distance. And what our databases aim to do is to open up that same opportunity to a university's entire research community, from undergraduate students to lecturers. And in the very beginning of developing one of our collections, we traveled to the archive and assess material for conservation needs. So typical conservation damage might include damage to the binding, damage from water, fire, mold, dirts and stains on the page, any loose, stuck or uncut pages, or even pest damage or residue. And the photograph on the right-hand side was taken on one of our editorial assessment trips to the National Library of Scotland. This is part of the John Murray Archive, which we digitised in our 19th Century Literary Society collection. And this shows a page where the ink has been smudged. It's also stained the opposite page, and this is something that's called offsetting. There's also a hole in the page which might indicate that iron gall ink was used, because iron gall is acidic and can degrade paper in this way. After assessing the items and contributing to their conservation needs at the archive, we will start to digitize the archival material. The image you can see on this slide here is called Atti's Book Drive, which can be used to scan bound items as opposed to loose items. And this is just one example of scanning equipment that might be used in a project. So the 120-degree cradle is adjustable to suit different types of binding. It also adjusts on its own to keep the spine in a central position throughout digitization, which reduces the amount the book needs to be manually handled during scanning. It also has 2 cameras, one to capture each page, so the capture process does not take longer than if you were digitizing double page, which again minimizes the number of times an item needs to be handled. So we take great care with the equipment that we use and our kind of partnering scanning companies use in digitizing these archival materials. And over the years, we've been very privileged to have partnered with archives, libraries, and museums in mainland Europe to digitize their rare materials, contributing to the conservation of this material and making it more widely available across the globe in the form of digital collections. So in France, we've worked with Bibliothèque Nationale de France a few times now, from collections like Age of Exploration to World's Fairs. In Germany, we've worked with different libraries and archives in Stuttgart, Heidelberg, and Berlin. For example, we've digitized some war periodicals of the National Socialist Party from the Second World War, which are housed in the Berlin State Library in our service newspapers of World War II collection. In Belgium, we've worked with the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp, who we partnered with for our Migration to New Worlds collection. And in Switzerland, we've worked with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Geneva, who we partnered with for our Medical Services and Warfare collection. And these are just a few examples of archives and heritage institutions we have partnered with. We also have primary source material covering European history and culture from around the world. And I've added a few of my own highlights on this slide, just to give you a little flavor of the types of things that might be included in many of our collections. So on the right-hand corner, you can see some material about the Spanish Civil War from our Medical Services and Warfare collection. There's a black and white photograph of the work of the medical service of the International Brigades in Spain. There's also a postcard promoting the ambulance corps, and I really love how visually striking this postcard is in its expression, using these really sharp angles and graphic red collars in both in the barbed wire and the costume of the nurse. And in the middle of the slide, I have 2 images from our food and drink and history collection, which is one of my personal favorite databases. Includes so much material on European cuisines and the migration of European cuisines to other continents, as well as material from the colonial pasts of different European countries. So here you can see an image from the cookbooks of Marcus Gaius Apicius, a famous gourmet from ancient Rome, and a book on home economy called Économie domestique by Andrzej Barbier, published in Congo in 1968, so 8 years after Congo became independent from Belgium. Finally, in the left-hand corner, we have a still from a documentary film from 1977 called Good Neighbors, which I find personally really interesting, as I'm Finnish and I'm from Finland, so I wanted to include something about Finland here as well. And this film is in our Socialism on Film collection. It was produced in the 1970s by Leningrad Documentary Film Studios, and it tries to show the friendly relations that exist between the Soviet Union and Finland during the Cold War. So while we have produced around 100 collections of archival material over the last 20 years, we have also recently published a new type of collection called Research Methods Primary Sources. This is an online learning tool for primary source literacy skills, and we're really excited to have 3 academic contributors for the collection to be speaking to us today. So a little bit about the kind of difference to other AM digital collections. This is about building the basic primary source literacy skills students would need to start making use of archival material contained in our other collections in their learning. So this is really the tool that helps students understand our other collections, the key that unlocks the type of material we have specialized in publishing. And the need for this collection has really arisen from working with faculty members and librarians for the last 20 years, integrating primary sources into the classroom and coming across similar challenges around archival literacy skills within undergraduate students, which can be at varied levels. And we wanted to provide a solution to that so that students have access to the tools that they need to achieve their learning outcomes. Research methods primary sources is split into 3 different learning pillars that form part of the site. So we have learning tools, case studies, and practice sources. And then as a 4th element, we also have included data sets in the collection. The first learning pillar in research methods primary sources are the learning tools. This section helps students understand how to use different types of archives, introduces them to key concepts in historical study, and provides practical tools for research. And you can see a few examples here. So one is called Ethical Considerations in the Archive. We have a video interview where you can meet a conservator and see what they do in the archive to preserve documents. And we have also help on how to use a library catalogue to find primary sources. So these are some of the kinds of things that might sit under learning tools. We also have over 140 case studies providing practical examples of how to analyze primary sources. So a student can learn how a researcher would work with specific types of sources like correspondence or financial records, or how to use these sources to investigate themes like revolution, indigenous history, or memory. So you can see some of the examples here, how to use church records of the late Middle Ages, how to use medical texts for historical research, and how to research fashion with primary sources. And all of our contributors today who are speaking to us have provided different case studies, and we'll be talking about the kind of primary source literacy skills that they've discussed within their case studies today. We also have primary sources attached to these case studies as part of the site, over 300 of them within research methods. So if you want to explore these practical sources further, you can also use the case studies as a pathway back into the original digital collection. So for example, you might read a case study on computers to China and how to analyze primary sources on technology. And you can look at this primary source within research methods primary sources as well. But then if you wanted to, you could also click on the collection that it comes from and go to the next collection, so popular culture in Britain and America, where this document sits, and you can look at other documents that sit alongside it within the archival collection contained in that digital resource. And now I'm really excited to be able to hand over to our first speaker. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Ainhoa Campos Posada, who's a researcher and part of the teaching staff at Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Her work is focused on social history, urban history, and the history of conflict and repression. And she's published widely on Madrid during the Spanish Civil War, especially. And today she'll be talking about the fights for the civil rights and approach through legal records. Over to you, Ainhoa.
Thank you. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can see you.
Fine. Good afternoon to all. First of all, I would like to thank Laura Bumbo for all the work she has done to organize this webinar today and for that flattering presentation. I would also like to thank you all for your patience with my English. I'm sorry I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, so sorry in advance, and for my broken voice because there are a lot of allergies in Madrid these days, but I promise to keep it short so I don't bother you a lot. As Laura has kindly told you, I am going to talk about legal records as a way to study the fight for the civil rights in the USA. If you take a look into my resume, you will see that I haven't focused my research on that issue, not even on American history. My area of expertise is, as Laura said, the problem of supply in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War. And I have also studied the social and cultural changes that took place during the Belle Epoque, that last part of the 19th century that changed the face of Europe. Very different topics, you could think, and you would be right, but they have something in common. When I first started studying the Belle Epoque, I did it through the Dreyfus Affair, a political scandal that involved a miscarriage of justice and split France in two halves. When I approached the Spanish Civil War in Madrid for the first time, it was through a very specific set of documentation, the records of courts in charge of prosecuting food crimes. And when I got interested in modern history of the United States of America, it was through a landmark case that is very well known in the US, but not that much in Spain, Brown v. Board of Education. These are very different topics, but they had in common the way I approached them, through legal records. Why I'm so interested in this specific source? Well, that's something I have questioned myself pretty often, I swear. With time, I have developed a satisfactory answer, which I'm giving to you today. Legal records are profoundly rich. They are really good historical source. On a first look, we could say that this kind of source provides us with information about the judicial system or the legal constitution of a certain country. But if we look further, we will see way more. We will see that it contains plenty of information about the social, cultural, and political context in which it was created. To begin with, legal and court records tend to compile a lot of data on the issue they deal with. For example, reports with quantitative data or detailed chronological examinations of a chain of events. The job of the lawyer or the public prosecutor has its similarities with that of the historian. All of them need to provide evidence to build an argumentation. That way, evidence used by a legal worker in a certain moment of the past can be used in the future for a historian to study that past. And as the legal process deals with precedents, it is also really useful to guide you through the events that set the scene of it, helping you to isolate causes and consequences. On the other hand, socially significant matters enrich the courts after gaining presence in society, in the public sphere. For example, if we see a lot of food crimes in Madrid during the Civil War, we can guess that there is a problem of supply in that moment in that city. Another example, if racial segregation is being disputed judicially, then it probably means that a growing part of the society, of the population of that country, is rebelling against it, as happened in the case of the United States. Furthermore, legal records provides us with information from different points of view on a certain issue. That way, we can follow strong debates that have split a society in two through the study of this documentation. Debates such as if a captain of the army is guilty of espionage. That's what happened with the Dreyfus Affair. Society was divided between those who thought that Dreyfus was guilty and those who thought that Dreyfus was a scapegoat and he was only blamed because of his Jewishness. Or, for example, debates on the idea of abortion. Is abortion a right or is abortion a crime? Using legal and court records has its disadvantages too, I must admit, and it is important to know them to be ready to overcome them, to have the tools to tackle them. First, it is impossible to make sense of a legal record without having at least a basic knowledge of the functioning of the legal and judiciary system in the country in which it was produced. The Anglo-Saxon legal system is very different from the one that operates in Spain, and this one, despite the similarities, it's different from the French. If you add time to the equation, then it's even more difficult. Differences are even bigger. This way, what you know about a specific country would not be enough to approach the study of a different one, and what you know about that country on the 18th century would be also insufficient to understand the same place 100 years later or before. Secondly, the language used in these sources makes them difficult to understand. The professional verbiage in which legal documents are written constitutes another obstacle on our path to access the information these sources contain. Thus, the only way to completely understand legal records is to take time to study the legal system that created them and to get to know the language in which they are written. But it is worth the pain, rest assured. If legal records are always useful to understand a specific society, they are even more valuable in systems in which the judicial branch is a powerful engine for change. That is the case of the United States of America. The rulings of the Supreme Court have been, and still are, fundamental in shaping the country's history. That is why the civil rights movement specifically chose to use the courts as a means to gain public notoriety and win battles against racism and segregation in the second half of the 20th century. And that makes legal courts and the records they made extremely valuable to study that movement. To sum up, legal records offer evidence far beyond the day-to-day functioning of the judicial or court system. It shows us which topics were being debated by society and the opposing positions that people took in them. It gives us official data, both qualitative and quantitative, about said topic. In conclusion, court and legal records were not originally created for the eyes of the historian, but they are very useful for the historical work in the future, in the present, when we are. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I will answer any question you have at the end of this webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Ainhoa, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, Ainhoa will be staying here for the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions to her, please feel free to pop them in the questions box in your control panel, and we'll get to them at the end. And next, we have our second speaker today, Professor Giampiero Brunelli from the Faculty of Literature and Philosophy at Sapienza Università di Roma. He's researched and written widely on European history, from early modern papacy to war in the modern age. For research methods primary sources, he contributed to 2 separate case studies. One was titled Using Sources to Explore Globalisation, an exploration of the role of the 16th century spice trade. But he also contributed a second case study, which was titled 18th Century Periodicals as Sources, a case study, The Ladies' Magazine from 1770. Today he will be speaking on how he approached these 2 different types of primary sources in his 2 case studies. So over to you, Giampiero.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. I was contacted by the editors commissioning case studies for research methods primary sources by email. I had never worked on this kind of teaching tools before, and it was a stimulating challenge. In this presentation, I hope I'll cover a few elements of what made researching and writing these articles particularly exciting. My first item was about the early history of globalization. I realized this was not an easy topic for a case study about the use of primary sources in historical research. We always tell our students that everything can be used as a primary source, from text, image, everyday objects, and landscapes to beliefs and what else. But in this case, this everything had a global dimension and included a wide range of centuries. How to approach this subject? AM's choice of digitized primary sources for this case study, the variegated imaginative, was of great help. Connecting them came almost effortlessly, and I used almost the entire set of sources provided. First, however, I addressed the concept of globalization. This is another thing I often do during classes, especially when I start my courses, showing historiographical models and notions. Thus, and this was a new discovery to me, I found out that the globalization concept had originated in a very different scientific area, French pedagogy of the beginning of 20th century, and that it had taken almost a century to enter the historian's toolbox. Drawing students' attention to the history of these concepts inspires in them a sense of wonder, so to speak, making them curious. Then, having reviewed the course of scholarship on globalization, I came to a definition. I always come to a definition. I propose to understand globalization as a process of convergence and integration of previously separate human groups, going from the intracontinental to the intercontinental and then to the global level. I conceive convergence and integration as products of conscious rather than episodic experiences, aiming to exchange goods, knowledge, and finally, values. This definition of globalization as a process of intentional exchange has important consequences for the way we approach primary sources in classes. First, we have to investigate documents left by the agents of this process. This could be public authorities, curious riders, or operators in economic activities. Each of them had particular aims and biases. We must keep in mind this point about bias, which coincides with general advice about the critical examination of sources, obviously. In my first case study, however, a particularly narrative taste, so to speak, emerged strongly, just as organizations like the Dutch and East India Company were establishing trade networks, say in the 16th century. Tales of encounters with the other were collated and distributed. This quickly became books. Richard Eckley's principal navigation is probably a perfect example in this regard. Therefore, students who are working with sources on early globalization, and I was looking at a particular case of the spice trade, I remember, come in contact with narratives that demonstrate ethnographic interests from the beginning of this process. Finally, this first case study, in this first case study, I dealt with also, finally, this first case study I dealt with also constitutes an exercise in the unveiling of Eurocentrism. Every image in every document cited is an example of this, but it's precisely this that makes it easier for the teacher to address the issue. Let me give you an example. I examined also a small book, Coffee from Grower to Consumer, by Benjamin Bailey Keeble, London, both and New York, Pittman, maybe 1923. Not sure. It is an item from a series of handbooks for technical students, the common commodities and industries, by the publisher Pittman and Sons. Keeble describes the coffee plant and its cultivation, the industrial preparation of the seeds for the market, the geographic dimension of its production. Well, without any embarrassment, the author wrote about, and I quote, the commercial depression which fell upon it with the abolition of slavery in the 1880s. Then the same book showed that plantation workers' life was, and still is, I understand, very hard, but it never pointed out this fact. One more thing, while we're on the topic of early globalization, and before I move on to my second case study, Andrew Matthew, as we all know, is making huge efforts in the field of automated digital transcription of manuscripts. I offered my small contribution in an old-fashioned way, but made it accessible to undergraduates. In fact, I found and signaled an already transcribed and published document in Old English that is nearly identical to the one included in the case study. In this way, students may come into contact with an important royal source, but they will not be put off by the early modern handwriting. On the contrary, perhaps, they will be enticed to undertake paleographical studies. My second primary source case study was on the 1770 issue of the Lady magazine. Analyzing a periodical gave me the opportunity to offer something even more innovative, if I may say so myself. I was already familiar with the world of early modern periodical publication. I've published a journal article discussing early modern manuscript newspaper during the 30 Years' War. Nonetheless, as I investigated 18th century periodicals again, designed through the lens of primary source literacy, it was immediately clear this was an extremely valuable primary source type for students wishing to understand this period better. Looking at the context once again as constitute the essential starting point. It's well known that there were many different kinds of periodical. The 18th century ones, and particularly the periodical essays, were often not interested in current events, but rather in the proposal of new values and behaviors. Well, only scholarship can help us to identify and distinguish the different kinds of periodicals. And we should not be afraid to engage our students with scholarship, which is our North Star, as usual, I think. Having built this solid foundation, students can progress to browsing the periodical. The approach immediately produces results. The students have a clear picture of the author's intention. They verify the existence of distinct recurring sections in any issue. They also obtain rich information about the 18th century society, in particular from the fictional section, which contains novels and letters published in issues. Insights emerge everywhere. I was able to cite many images of PDF pages in this case study. Beware though, working on the Lady magazine reminded me and can teach students that fictional literature is not a direct descriptive source. Every piece of information acquired from this kind of source should be critically examined against other pertinent documents. So what, I ask myself, what can I ask the source without too many complications? After a while, I came to this answer. The most efficient alternative to the dangerous hunt for illuminating literary passages about the 18th century British society lies in a solid scan of the contents of the Lady magazine, which is to say, in a database analysis of the journal. It's a challenge that was first attempted in 1977 paper card era. Today, with a simple table or elementary spreadsheet, even undergraduates can try their hand at this with some success. So I had no hesitation after convincing the editorial staff of what I was doing, and it wasn't so easy, I have to confess. I offered an interpretive grid and even a set of fields to be used for the analysis of the journal. Then it became natural to zoom in on some of the 70 issues of contents. A relevant repository of topics emerged, and I could signal many other PDF images from the digitized source. aiming at making a broader conclusion, this revealed itself decisive in managing this kind of source. In fact, the method at play is easy to replicate. Every issue of every 18th century periodical can be analyzed using this tool, which I believe makes it incredibly valuable to students who want to improve their primary source analysis skills for periodical in this period. So that's it. I look forward to hearing all your questions and comments. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Giampiero. That was excellent. So finally, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Professor Jerzy Zdanowski, who's a professor of humanities, historian and political scientist at Andrzej Frycz Modrzewski, Krakow University. He's researched the modern and recent history of the Middle East since 1974, with a focus on Muslim law, intercultural contacts, development issues and international relations. And today he'll be giving us a presentation on using government documents, diplomatic service correspondence of 20th century history. Over to you.
Hi. Can I start my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, Laura, thank you. It was a great pleasure to take part in the Adam Matthew project, and thank you for the opportunity to attend today's seminar. My participation was related to using government documents for academic study. There are many types of government documents, and one of them is diplomatic correspondence, or documents of a country's foreign service, most often issued by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the embassies of the country in other countries. The documents, the government documents, and especially diplomatic service correspondence is stored in the archives. It is an interesting institution. So let me say a few words about archives. It is an important institution because it collects knowledge about the past. I was lucky to look for diplomatic correspondence, diplomatic documents in the numerous archives in the USA, UK, France, but also Turkey, Saudi Arabia, or Oman. And there are huge, extensive archives, such as the Public Records Office in Kew in London, or the French Ministry of War in the Vincennes Castle in Paris, and also small ones, such as the Reformed Church in America archives in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Each of them is organized slightly differently. In some of them, the documents are perfectly cataloged and their delivery is automated. In others, the knowledge of a librarian should be counted on, and this knowledge is usually vibrant. Some archives are available to all. Reaching others requires many passes and often knowing the right people. But despite these differences, there is something in common to all of them. It is the moment when we receive a box of records, a box of documents, and open it with some excitement, whether we find what we are looking for there or not. The source I analyzed in the Adam Matthew project came from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It included 32 letters and telegrams arranged in chronological order regarding the steps taken by the Foreign Office and the British Embassy in Algiers to liberate a British citizen sentenced to death for drug trafficking in Algeria. It was a dramatic moment, but fortunately, this man was safe from death, although it was a significant challenge for the British diplomatic service. However, let us discuss some more general comments about what we can gain from studying diplomatic correspondence or government documents in general and diplomatic correspondence in particular. On the one hand, government documents are a vast source of knowledge about the past. They were usually created at the time of the event under study, as opposed to secondary sources reflecting past events. Using these raw materials of history stimulates curiosity, filling the atmosphere of past events and developing critical thinking and analysis skills. These documents reveal many fascinating phenomena and tell stories that inspire reflection and analysis in the present day. Let's say landmark court cases, parliamentary hearings, censuses, eyewitness accounts, photographs, letters, posters, diaries, and memoir allow insights into various multifaceted topics and compare how interpretation have changed over time. For example, censuses make it possible to show the influence of various factors on long-term process, population growth, on land use, so on. It is tempting for a historian to reconstruct the past based on primary sources. And it is fascinating how much a single document can tell us about the past. An example would be the Magna Carta from 1215, a single document, and how much we can learn about society from that period. The same was the case with my documents, telegrams regarding a British prisoner in Algiers, opened windows on history, influential personalities in Algeria, or people's mentality, generally speaking. So this is on one hand, but on the other hand, we can ask if the diplomats who produce these correspondence were neutral observers, and how objective or subjective diplomats' assessments of the countries they were stationed in were. In other words, how reliable the information contained in the sources is. So here there are 2 points, in my opinion, to note. First of all, the diplomats' assessments are subjective, but they are subjective to the extent that any assessment is a subjective thing, and any interpretation is biased. A personal experience, understanding, and beliefs about an investigated object are inherent components of the evolution process that determines an assessment. It should be remembered that diplomats are not mindless and objective researchers, but government officials who rely on skills and intuition and filter data through an interpretative lens. So the discussed source proves that diplomatic correspondence is written carefully, but functionally is biased. The second point here is that it is advisable to start any analysis of any diplomatic correspondence by figuring out how the facts that became the basis for the assessment of the situation were collected. The collection of facts is an art, and when consider how the information in the documents has been collected, one has to ask to what extent the information is representative and can be generalized from. The variation of techniques employed to collect information and attempts to corroborate that information suggests some level of credibility can be attributed to any report. However, the very selection of the sources the report is based upon is entirely individual and subjective, and checking this information by going back to the sources is practically impossible. So it should prompt us to be cautious and try to confirm the facts in other records of a given source or even outside the source. Thus, diplomatic correspondence is a massive resource of knowledge about the past. However, using it requires understanding the process and methods of data collection and the creation of comprehensive reports by diplomatic services. Furthermore, the archives still contain enormous resources of knowledge about the past. Currently, more and more documents are digitized, and it is not necessarily necessary to travel to the other end of the world to find what interests us. Many documents are still waiting for someone to read them for the first time. So be the first ones, and thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerzy, and thank you to all of our three speakers. If you just turn off your camera and we'll turn them back on for the Q&A. Just a reminder for our audience that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I just have a few more kind of slides to show before we open up for the Q&A, but that should take a minute or so, and then we'll I can see some questions popping in already, so please keep them, please start writing them now. So let me just show my screen again. So these are some of the documents that Jerzy was talking about. So I just wanted to mention that you can request a free 30-day trial of any AM digital collection, and this includes research methods, primary sources, where all of our contributors and speakers today have written case studies. So if you want to read the case studies that they've written within the collection and see how they are integrated with the primary sources, you're very welcome to get in touch with us and request a free trial of the collection. And you can do that by getting in touch with us directly, or there's also on our website, you can go to amdigital.co.uk/products/free trials and submit a request. And if you want to get in touch, my name is Laura Blumvall, and my email is lauraB@amdigital.co.uk. And I also have my colleagues Nia Phillips and Catherine Berry, who also are good contacts for libraries in Europe. If you have any requests for prices or requests for free trials, feel free to get in touch with any of the three of us. And I'm just going to stop showing my screen now, and we'll open up for the Q&A. So I'm just going to turn on my camera, and if you guys can also do that, we'll start doing some of the questions. Great. Jerzy and Giampiero, would you be able to kind of turn on your cameras?
Yes, I think I managed to turn.
So we have one question from Giampiero. So we have a question on what primary sources you used in your analysis of the 16th century global spice trade. And this is from Stefan Smith. We can't hear you at the moment. I think you're still having some audio issues.
Wait.
Oh, yes, now we can hear you.
Now it's good. Okay.
Yeah, great.
Mostly narrative sources, because this was the one that was the ones that were offered by my set of sources. I tried to integrate them with some articles, but most narrative sources. The principal navigation by Eclut is the best for this purpose.
Right, and I can just add to that the source that used in the research methods primary sources case study was an East India Company document. So that's available both in the research methods primary source collection and in our East India Company collection. So if you're interested more in the kind of early modern spice trade and the kind of primary sources on that, those would be kind of two really good collections to trial.
One more thing, there was a royal chart. The chart I was talking about, an original royal chart at the beginning of the 17th century. Very difficult to read, but I was lucky to find a twin document already edited. And so I can offer my readers transliteration, translation in a common English.
Yeah, perfect. And we do in the East India Company also have handwritten text recognition, so you can run word searches through manuscript documents as well to kind of help with the searching of those documents. We have a question for all of the panel from Helen Farrell. She's saying, first of all, thank you to all of the speakers for very interesting presentations. And she's asking, what is the one piece of advice you would give to faculty starting out in using primary sources in the classroom for the first time? So what advice would you give to instructors using primary sources in the classroom for the first time? Ainhoa, do you want to go first?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I think that the key is to start gradually, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each specific source has. For example, I usually use oral sources in the classroom. So I need to make my students realize what are they for and what are they not, and how they need to be really cautious when they are interviewing somebody and things like that. So I think that you need to prepare the students for the characteristics of the source and maybe give them an example of how to deal with one of these sources, and then choose one that is not difficult and easy to understand source, so they can start to evaluate it to criticize it, and then pass to bigger or more difficult things by themselves.
Great. That's such a good answer. Jerzy, do you have anything that you'd like to add in terms of tips for instructors using primary sources in the classroom?
Yes, and with great pleasure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I think that the document you show, Laura, the second document, it can be excellent example of studying primary sources in the classroom. This is a telegram from Algiers that a British subject was arrested and that he was sentenced to death because of drug trafficking in Algeria. So you can be surprised why Algeria, why a British, and when, and what happened in Algeria at the time. It was in 1972. So this information can be a starting point to discover a broader context, including the events in Algeria and also a relationship between Algeria and other worlds. And of course, you need to use some secondary sources, but it can be very well organized in the classroom, for example, by suggesting particular groups, teams, or individual pupils or students to present chosen parts of the history of Algeria or history of drug trafficking in the Middle East, and also the position of the British Foreign Office and steps taken by. So from one page, you can develop, you can go to broader sources, and you can create quite a large picture of the events under study. So that's what I can suggest.
Great. That's fantastic.
One more thing, if I can, let your students dive into documents, just like it was at the Blue Sea. It's true. We have to sustain the critical point of view on documents. They are always biased, and it's very important to us to let our students to understand this. But let them dive into them, because the impact that an old document to your students is very fruitful, and so you don't miss it. Let them dive into them.
Great, thank you.
Yes, I totally agree with Giampiero that this is very fruitful work to introduce primary sources to students, because it opens a very interesting, fascinating window into the past. However, it is not easy, and it suggests some assistance. You have librarians extremely knowledgeable, and their position, for example, in the leading libraries is extremely valuable and appreciated. And you can really, you cannot be afraid of entering any archives where you have tons of documents, tons of records, because you can rely on an assistant. For example, if you enter the public records in queue, in London, there is a special line written for those who are new to Q. So if you are new to Q, you can get a special assistance. So that is my remark. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, all three of you. I feel like kind of diving into the deep sea of primary sources is a really good note on which to end the webinar. I realize we're kind of on the hour now. I just wanted to kind of thank, if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to email me, and I'm sure any of our speakers would be happy to kind of be emailed any further questions if you have them. And I just want to kind of say a thank you for a few colleagues who've been really crucial in helping behind the scenes to organize this webinar. So my colleagues Holly and colleagues Nia and Dot, who've been helping with rehearsals and helping organize and set up, and other colleagues in the marketing team as well. Then a huge thank you to Giampiero, Ainhoa and Jerzy for taking the time to present these case studies to us today and to speak to us all. I found it extremely interesting, and I hope everyone else has as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Right.
Thank you very much.
And everyone have a lovely rest of the day, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.